Genesis chapter 14, and I'm going to begin to read at verse 17 down to the end of the chapter. After Abram returned from defeating Chedorlaomer and the kings allied with him, the king of Sodom came out to meet him in the valley of Shaveh, that is, the king's valley. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High, and he blessed Abram, saying, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand." Then Abram gave him a tenth of everything. The king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give me the people and keep the goods for yourself." But Abram said to the king of Sodom, "I have raised my hand to the Lord, God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and have taken an oath that I will accept nothing belonging to you, not even a thread or a thong of a sandal, so that you will never be able to say, 'I made Abram rich.' I will accept nothing but what my men have eaten, and the share that belongs to the men who went with me, to Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. Let them have their share." Well, we're halfway through our part of this series tonight, and it's been good to be with you. It's been good to be ministered to by our brother Arthur. And it always amazes me how God brings things together we have never met before, and yet I hope we all sense that God, both in his messages and I trust from Genesis, has been building this marvelous theme of serving Christ in our generation. Now, just from my side, I'd like to recap so that you'll have an idea where I'm going, or at least where I should have gone. I don't know if I got there or not. But we want to see three things. Two we've mentioned already, and a third tonight. If we are going to serve Christ in our generation, then like Abraham, we need to have a call from God that is life-changing, that causes us to forsake all and follow him, putting our faith in his word alone. And we saw this morning that if we are going to serve Christ in our generation, we, like Abraham, must have our faith tried and tested. It must be put through the crucible. It must be refined and purified, so that the promises of God will become even more precious as we experience the providence of God in our experience. And tonight, our third principle is, if we are going to serve Christ in our generation, we, like Abraham, must be in the world, but not of the world. We must be in the world, but not of the world. And as we look at our passage tonight, I've just read the last half of it. We will be discussing the entire chapter. We're going to see two things. We're going to see Abraham in the world, and we're going to see Abraham not being of the world, not being a part of the world in the real sense. First of all, then, Abraham in the world. Now, obviously, with there's only 6 times that I have the privilege of sharing the word with you, there's much about the life of Abraham that we have to skip over. I hope your appetite's been whetted a little bit, and that you will read the places that we don't specifically deal with, whether it's now or when you go home after the conference. I don't mean right now, but I mean now while you're here at the conference. In chapter 13, Abraham's faith again will be refined and purified and tested in the place of promise, the promised land. God is into faith, and he is into a faith that is continually being weaned from trusting in or looking to or relying upon anything in this world for its sustenance, for its maintenance, for its growth. And so in chapter 13, this land that has been promised to Abraham will be a place of feuding. Feuding between the herdsmen of Abram and the herdsmen of Lot. Abram will die to himself. We saw in chapter 12, that's the thing that Abram did not want. to do, and that is to die. He wanted to live. He did not want to be killed. And you might get the impression from our session this morning that Abraham got off scot-free. God just kind of comes in at the last moment and rescues him and delivers him. And not only rescues and delivers him, gives him his wife back, but blesses him with an incredible amount of abundance, with extra flocks and extra herds and extra servants. And so he goes back to the promised land, in one sense wealthier than when he first entered into Egypt. And it's very easy for us to get the impression that God's kids get away with murder because this is of grace. But oh no, God's kids will learn the lessons. I remember when I was in public school, it was quite a few years ago now, but I remember when I was in public school, I remember those small seats. And in our public school, we had those kind of seats with kind of the desk right on the seat. It was a one-piece item. And not being that big, I sat in the seat pretty good. But as I moved along in my academic career in public school, I noticed some awful big kids filling those seats. Some of them had been in the same seat for 2 and 3 years. Because when I went to public school, there was this kind of dumb policy that you don't get into grade 3 until you've passed grade 2. Now, the Ministry of Education has abandoned that dumb policy. You don't have to pass grade 2 or grade 3 or grade 8 or any grade. You just have to kind of, be there. But back when I went to school, they just didn't put you ahead because you were a big kid and could hardly fit in a seat. You actually had to pass the year. And that's exactly what the Lord does with his children. He doesn't just push us ahead. Well, you've been in the class long enough. You better move on to the next grade. Because, of course, what they recognized back then and what the Lord knows is that if you didn't learn it in grade 2, how in the world will you ever figure out grade 3 or grade 4 or grade 5 or grade 9 or second year of college? And Lord never puts any of his kids ahead just because they've been around so long. He's a little tired of them and they better move on to the next class. Abraham will learn the lesson that God intends for him. Abraham will learn the lesson in the land of promise that he must die if he wants to live. And so they go up in a vista and they look over the land of promise. And Abraham, who had received the promise, says, listen, brother, nephew, Lot, we're not going to be able to coexist because of the abundance of our flocks and our herds. You choose first where you want to go. His faith is growing. He's dying to himself. That went against everything of their culture, that the older man would step back so that the younger man might have the first choice. Lot will see this by sight. All he can see is a beautiful Jordan River and a seemingly well-watered Jordan Valley. And he looks at his flocks and his herds and he says, well, that obviously is the best land. And so he chooses it. After he leaves, God says to Abraham, now you just look all around. But you must look by faith, and you will see that all of this land is yours. He's growing in his faith, isn't he? Because in the land of promise, he has to learn to die. But what he is learning is that when God has promised you everything, then you can give away everything. When God has promised you that you can only live because of your relationship with him, then you can learn to die. Well, we come to chapter 14, and again, the land of promise will be a place of testing of the faith of Abraham. There was feuding between the herdsmen of Lot and Abram, but in chapter 14, there's fighting. We're in the world. And we may be discouraged sometimes when we see, in some ways, how the brothers and sisters of the Lord don't always quite get along. There's some feuding and scrapping once in a while. But we're brothers. We're sisters. And we may think it isn't that good in the church, but it's a lot better than in the world. Because you see, in the world, they fight. It's all out. It's the brass knuckles. It's the heavy boots. Because you see, in the world, that's all the world has, is the world. You only go around once. You may as well get a babe and a beer and do it with all the gusto you got, because you only go around once. And on their chariots, they used to have bumper stickers back then. He that dies with the most toys wins. Abraham lives in that kind of a world, where it's dog eat dog, where it's survival of the fittest, where the big guy beats up the little guy to get ahead. And to get ahead in the terms of this world's goods, because that's all there is this world. And so what happens is Abraham is just minding his own business with his tent and his altar and his flock and his possessions and his wife. And he sees a runner coming. And the guy's running and panting, and eventually he arrives and bows before Abram, and he has a message. There's trouble. There's trouble for his nephew, Lot. Lot's in trouble. He's in a real mess. You see, what's happened is that Lot just went over to where it's nice. He's got all these flocks, he's got all these herds. What do you do with all of these animals? After all, you can only eat so many lambs and so many roast beef dinners. With all of this abundance, you need a market, don't you? And he noticed that over where it is well watered, there are cities there. Names like Sodom, Zoar, Gomorrah. And where there are cities, there are people. And as we all know so well at this conference, where there's people, there must be eating. And where there's eating, there must be food. And so first of all, Lot moves near Sodom. And eventually he'll move into Sodom. And he's a righteous man. In fact, he's grieved. He's grieved daily by what he sees, what he experiences. But what better place to be a testimony than in Sodom? But anyways, the message comes to Abram that Lot has been captured. All his possessions. You see, what's going on here is that in the world, it's this life. It's all you got. And so you go for it. And you see, there were 4 kings up in the north in an area called Shinar. And Shinar is another name for Babylon. Abram knew that area well. In fact, he had left it. And these 4 kings, led by their head honcho, Chedorlaomer, what they did was go into the Jordan Valley and they subjugated 5 petty kings. And what they did in the ancient world was a lot like I guess they do in the modern world, that they subjugated these people and said, listen, we won't really bother you as long as you pay a tribute or pay taxes. And we want so much from this city and so much from that town and so much from that village. And if you kind of pay us what we want, we won't bother you. Well, for 12 years this went on. And these 5 kings got together. And in the 13th year, they said, we're tired of this. And so they decided to rebel. Well, the kings in the north weren't overly thrilled that there was kind of a drying up of their financial resources from the south. And so they got together and they decided that they'd go down and teach these guys a lesson. On the way down, they beat up about 6 other places as well, just so that there would be no help from the residents, so they could cover their backs. And so they go down into the Jordan Valley, And they just beat the living daylights out of these 5 guys, and then they get their taxes. They get their tribute. Obviously, Lot was doing very well, and so he was a prime target. And they haul this guy off with all of his possessions. And Abram gets this memo. His nephew's in trouble. Now, if you were Abram, what would you do about Lot? Now, you must remember that Abram has an aversion to dying. He's not that keen on getting killed. Remember in chapter 12? Baby, if you really love me, you'll do this so that I won't get killed. And God is going to constantly bring into his life the fact that he must risk his life if he wants to live. Now, he could have looked there and said, as he looked at this memo, and said, well, you know that Lot. That guy, he's always the opportunist, always working the angles. I knew when we stood on that hill that day that he was making a wrong choice. I tried to tell him. Well, he's made his bed, let him lie in it. After all, I'm a farmer. I'm a cattleman. I'm a nomad. And there's no way that I'm going to take on these characters and rescue my nephew. Well, he got what's coming to him. And he could have followed up the memo, and he could have said to the guy, well, you have to go back and tell him, I'll be praying for him. But amazingly, Abram doesn't do that. I guess a little bit like South Africa, he had security forces. He had 318 men in his entourage who were trained to protect his provisions and his property and his wealth. He also had some buddies. And so he got these guys together, and he says, we got a problem. My nephew's been captured. We must rescue him. And so they booted up north. They finally tracked these guys down. You can imagine that they're pretty happy. That is, the guys who won the battle. There's wine, women, and song, I'm sure. And so they have a night attack. They divide their forces. And probably while these guys are partying and not quite all in their right minds, they attack these guys, they beat them up, and they rescue Lot and the other people and all of their possessions. No, that's what it means to be in the world. The world gets itself in lots of messes, doesn't it? If you've been faithful to your wife, why would you care about AIDS? But we live in a world, because they think this is all it is, they go for it with all the gusto they've got. And they're continually doing tremendous damage to themselves. And as I mentioned this morning, sometimes our brothers and sisters get in the messes of the world. Why would Abram risk his life for Lot? Why would he go to a seemingly impossible situation and by faith attack those guys and rescue his brother? Well, because Abram's been there. He was in a mess, do you remember this morning? And God had mercy on him. And you see, as we live in the world, it's very easy for us to look at the world and somehow think that from a distance, from our sanitized distance, that we will serve Christ in this world. And we can go around and we hope that we don't get touched. We hope that we don't become contaminated. We hope that somehow, as we seek to present Jesus Christ, that somehow none of this will come off on us. And after a while, we can become very calloused, very cold, even cruel. You can say, well, good. They deserve it. They've been warned. They've been told. They've been shown how wrong it is. How many times do they have to go through that experience and not learn the lesson? And we can think that we're impacting and serving Christ in our generation because what we're doing is standing back, kind of in a glass house, and saying, this is the gospel, here it is, come and get it. And hoping to God that we're not overly involved with these people. Because it might be the death of us. I'd love to be a missionary if you didn't have to go to another country. Missionaries die from disease, from acts of cruelty and violence. It's not easy being involved in a world that is desperate to do anything to suppress the truth of Jesus Christ. And to go into that world in its mess and its disaster and say, now listen, I'm here. And I'm going to come into this and I will help fight the battles. And I will expose myself to great risk because I want to serve Jesus in my generation. We are to be in the world. About an hour from where we live, there are very dear people. They're called Mennonites. They're very interesting people because what they think God has done is kind of on his TV remote. You didn't know God had a TV remote, but on his TV remote, he kind of freeze-framed a certain time in history as the holy time. You know what I mean? There was that time when there were no cars and no electricity and no this and no that, and that was the holy time. And although it's 100 years later, and there are cars and TVs and electricity and all of these things, these people are living in the midst of all of this, but they're not in the world. And they're a curiosity. They're part of the tourist industry. So people can come and look at them and gawk at them and say, boy, those are strange looking hats they wear. Isn't that kind of neat, interesting? Their vehicle actually does have horsepower. And the drab clothing, the good cooking, but it's a tourist thing. And amazingly, these people feel that they are being faithful to Jesus Christ in their generation. By freeze-framing the whole thing, and even though their generation has gone on, they are able to say that certain things in their culture are evil and sinful and this and that and the other thing, and they just back off from it. They have nothing to do with it, and they're going to impact it. And they're basically just on postcards. And you go into their shops to look at their quilts or their furniture. But you don't leave sensing Christ is there. Because it's not our generation. It's not where life is at. And God uses Abraham to go into a culture that is violently opposed to everything that he stands for. And he will risk his life. Because he's in this world. Well, that's half the story. I'll be honest with you, one of my objectives tonight is to preach so long that there won't be a question period. I didn't tell our brother that, but boy, you know, this is the easy part. It's those questions that are the hard part. Although Arthur seems to love that. Maybe you just give him all the questions. We've seen him being in the world. Now we have to see him not being of the world. After the war, after the battle, they've gone way up north into Damascus. They've now come back to a place called the King's Valley. the valley of Sheva. That's found in verse 17. It's a very interesting location because it's the first time in the Bible, in the life of Abram, that mentions that he has ever been here. He will come back to this area one more time in chapter 22. Do you know where this area is? It's the area that will ultimately be Jerusalem. And as he returns with all the booty, with all the spoils of war, with all the women, with all of the people who have been freed, who had been taken captive, amazingly, there's a welcoming committee there. And do you know who meets him? Well, the king of Sodom is there. He's probably the top king of these 5 petty kings. And he's there, and he's about to give a speech. He's got the key to the city. He's got, that thing they want to put around your neck. They're going to have a ticker tape parade for Abram. They're just so grateful for what he has done. There is somebody else there to welcome him as well. He too is a king. He is not the king of Sodom, he is the king of Salem, which ultimately becomes Jerusalem. We'll look at the king of Sodom first. The king of Sodom comes in verse 21, and as he's shaking Abram's hand, he says, "Listen, this is what we would like to do for you. We're incredibly grateful for what you've done. You give me the people, you give me the citizens of our various cities who have been captured, and you have now released them. And we will give you all the spoil. We will give you all of the goods that you have recaptured that previously belonged to us." Now, initially, that seems very fine. He's in the world, after all. He's part of the world to some degree. But Abraham says an amazing thing. He says, "Well, thank you, Your Majesty." That's kind of in the Hebrew, not in the English. "Thank you, Your Majesty, but I took an oath before the God who has made absolutely everything that is. And I swore to him that I will accept nothing that belongs to you. Not even a thread or a shoelace." That's astounding, isn't it? He says, in fact, the only thing that we have taken from your possessions are the food that was necessary to get us back from Damascus into the Valley of the Kings. Other than that, I want absolutely nothing from you. Now, my buddies, and he's basically saying because they're of this world, they can have all the spoil and rewards and honors that they want. I will not keep them from being rewarded for their efforts. But as for me, I don't even want a shoelace from you guys. And you might think, well, why? Well, he tells us. He says, "I don't want to take anything from you so that you will never be able to say, 'I made Abram rich.'" You see, Abram's not of this world. I don't know what evangelicalism is like here in South Africa, but boy, in Canada, in the United States, we desperately, desperately crave the recognition and the applause of the world. We just think, oh, if that famous baseball player could only get saved, if Julia Roberts could only get saved, if George Clooney could only get saved. We're not sure now about Michael Jackson, but, we... And we somehow think that, Christianity would really be legitimate, it would really be on the map, it would really be something if the world recognized it. And Abraham isn't interested in the world recognizing the greatness of the believer. Because you know what the problem with the world is? It always wants to share the credit. It wants some of the glory. You just look at the famous people in the world. And when you begin to see their bios, when they become known and you understand them, and if they're decent people and upright people, doesn't the world want to take credit? Well, they should be fine. They've gone to some of our finest acting schools. In America, it's especially well. This is the country where anybody can start at the bottom and go right to the top. And the world prides itself that it has the ability to give life, in spite of what has just occurred. You see, the world only has the ability to take life. It cannot give life. It eats its young alive. Sees some pretty girl, and they say, we can make a star out of you. Now, you can't eat properly, and when you do eat, you better throw up. And we want you to prance around and show everything pretty well that's to be shown. We want you to go from this to that to the other thing. And when you're 32 and you've kind of lost it, we'll toss you aside, because there's lots of pretty girls out there who would love to be a star. And it's the same with our athletes, and it's the same with all that we do. All that we can do is suck the life out of people, so that their life and their success will somehow contribute to the glory of the world. Isn't that true? Doesn't the world jump on everything? And they're there with their mics and their roving reporters and say, now tell me, how did you do that? And invariably it's twisted around so that they are going to be able to say, that's a product of our society. You come to South Africa, that's what South Africa can do for you. And Abraham says, thanks, but no thanks. Oh, I'm in this world, but I'm not of this world. What Abraham is saying is that I want no human explanation for my life. I don't want anybody to trace back and say, well, no wonder. Look at the parents he had. No wonder he went to Harvard. No wonder. And what Abraham is learning is that the Christian life is supernatural. There are no natural explanations. And the world desperately wants to share the glory of what God is doing in his people and doing through his people. You know 1 Corinthians chapter 1 well. You will notice when you look around at your congregation, there's not many wise. There's not many great. There's not many noble. Most of us are the guys they don't choose for the team, if you know what I mean. Oh, the odd time God saves somebody significant. But oh, he humbles them. He breaks them so that he can remake them. He breaks them so that the world will be knocked out of them. And Abraham said, been there, done that, got the t-shirt. I lived in the world. I know what the world does. It is always sucking the life out of everything so that it can masquerade itself as a place where there really is life. So that it can mask itself as a place that really gives life. But the reality is that all you have is blood and carnage and death and battle. Talking to someone the other day, They knew somebody who literally lived the entire 20th century. And they were saying, amazingly, they remember buggies and horses and this and that and the other thing, and then cars, and they were talking about to think that they've actually saw through TV a man on the moon, and this and that and the other thing. And they were going on about all the wonderful things that this person had seen over the last 100 years. And being the fun guy I am, I said, yeah, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, Vietnam, atrocities here, atrocities there. And no, we don't deny that there are things in this world because of the common grace of God that are good. But this is a killing field. Abram saw what they did to his brother in the Lord, what they would have done if he hadn't rescued him. And we live in a world that desperately needs to be impacted by people who are in this world but not of this world. I don't need their key to the city. I don't need their plaque on the wall. I don't need the chain around my neck. I don't need to be on Larry King Live. I don't know if you have Larry King Live here. He's everywhere in the United States. Anybody and everything that's done anything is interviewed by Larry King Live. And they love the live part. Live and live are actually the same word. But I don't need that stuff. Somebody else met him at the welcoming ceremonies. His name is Melchizedek, a strange, strange person. This is the only time he appears in the Bible. He comes with bread and wine. Now that isn't a prefiguring of communion. He is coming with the basic foodstuffs of this world that are necessary to keep you alive. Now, we might not think of wine as a basic foodstuff, but it was. And Abram is met by this strange person who brings sustenance for him and his troops. I think what he was saying is, with food and clothing, be content. And that's why the Lord Jesus Christ, what he is saying is that in his broken body and his shed blood that are symbolized and emblemized by bread and wine, he is saying, as essential as those things are to you physically, what is most essential for your life is the brokenness and the bleeding of Abraham's greater son. This man comes. He's a king. He's a king of Shalom, which means peace. In fact, his name Melchizedek, Melech, is the Hebrew word for king. Zadok is the Hebrew word for righteousness. Obviously, there's a connection between righteousness and peace, isn't there? And he comes and he brings this foodstuff to Abram, and then he not only acts as a king, because you see, kings can only give you the things of this world, can they? Sodom, the king of Sodom said, you can have all the junk you want. But he's a priest. And what he is able to do is mediate for Abram, and he is able to give this man the blessing of God. And he prays and he says, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, the creator of heaven and earth." Now, if we were to trace the word blessing through Genesis so far, we would see that it was found in Genesis chapter 1. And the blessing of God is that effective speaking of God, so that, like when he says, "Let there be light," and there is, and he says, "Let there be that," and there is, He is able to pronounce good words for people that are actualized in their experience. And what he is saying is that the explanation for the life of Abram is that the blessing of God rests upon him. It wasn't because he went to the right school. It's not because he took karate as a kid. It's not because there's no explanation for his life except that the blessing of God rests upon him. And that's not an assumed after Genesis 3. Because in Genesis 3, there's another kind of word from God, which is curse. And that too is effectual. And God speaks certain things, and he pronounces judgment on certain things, and it comes true. And ever since Genesis 3, what is true of this world is that it is under the curse of God. In our very living, we are dying, aren't we? And what we desperately need in the midst of all of this curse is the blessing of God upon us. And Abram realizes that the explanation for his life is the blessing of God. And who is this God? Is he a local deity? Did he come from Shinar? Is he one of the gods of the Jordan Valley? Is he one of the gods of Canaan proper? No. That's too confining. That's too limiting. He is the Most High. He dwells in light inapproachable. Not even the heaven of heavens can contain him. He has made all of these things that are. He has brought into being by his very speaking the heavens and the earth. And he upholds everything that he brought into being by the word of his power, doesn't he? Now that's who I want to be blessed by. And that's who Abram wants to be blessed by. And then he goes on in his blessing and he says, Melchizedek says, as the high priest, he says, "And blessed be God Most High." Why? Because he delivered your enemies into your hand. What's the explanation of the victory? The hand of God, the blessing of God, the intervention of God in the human affairs of this world, with all of its sin and sorrow and conflict and bloodletting, with all of its cemeteries. It is the presence and the power and the hand of God who is determining the outcome of things for the sake of his people. No wonder he doesn't want the keys to the city. Now we must understand that if we're not of the world, that doesn't mean we'll get glory, but it won't be from the world. Worldliness is not smoking or chewing or this or that or the other thing, and I'm not encouraging any of those things. Worldliness is acting like the world at the heart of the matter. Worldliness is saying that there is some explanation for all of this within the world itself. Whether it's the gods or goddesses that we've concocted from our worldview, or whether it's education or training or good looks or whatever it might be. Worldliness is saying that the only explanation for life can be found right here on planet Earth. Now, your thing may be different than my thing. I can live with that if you can live with that. But you see, the man of faith who seeks to serve Christ in this generation recognizes that the battle is over. Who will get the glory? And he's not in the battle. It's not that I will get glory, but I will get it religiously instead of worldly. No, the unique thing about the believer is he is saying, no, the one who will get the glory is the Most High God. Because the explanation for my life is the blessing of God. The explanation for my life is that God has handed my enemies into my hand. The explanation for my life is the God who is outside of time and space will enter into time and space so that he will get the glory. That's what it means to be not of this world. And for God to get the glory is not just a cliche, it's not just a reformed thing to say. It is a thing that every person in this room, starting with the pulpit, struggles with constantly. And to the degree that I don't realize how mercied I have been, how graced I have been, how blessed I have been, I will be looking for glory somewhere. And ultimately, it will be worldly. But only men like Abraham, who have been in Shinar, who have been in Egypt, who have failed in the promised land, only men and women who can say, but for the grace of God, I'd have been where Lot was. Only people who are out in this world and involved with this world and touched by the sin and the sorrow and the curse of this world and are moved with compassion on what the world does to those who are in the world will be able to say, this is all of God. Because you see, when you're in the world seeking to impact it for Jesus Christ, you know it's humanly impossible, isn't it? You can't change anybody. You can't even change yourself. Can't change your wife, can't change your husband, can't change your kids, can't change your parents, can't change your people. And as we were very powerfully reminded this morning, that's why we have to be moved with love and compassion and mercy for our people. Because what they desperately need is that God would bless them. That God would do something supernatural in this world. That God would come with the power of His might and do things that we cannot do humanly. And when we really see that, we will bless the God Most High. As long as we're convinced, and that's why theology is so important. And that's why it isn't just a joke to believe that people have an ability within themselves, and some guys are Calvinists and some guys are Arminians, and we just kind of have a little in-house squabble. But the reality is one of us saying there's absolutely nothing that can be done except for divine intervention. And the other says, oh, but there's still some potential. They may not be alive, but they're not dead. And if God just kind of comes and helps, and oh, it isn't that at all. We live in a world that we must impact for Jesus Christ. But we will never impact on this world by being like it. We have our awards, don't we? And I appreciate all kinds of things, and it's not a hobby horse or anything, but it always amazes me how the world has its singing awards, so we have our singing awards. And then the world has its Outstanding Citizen of the Year, so we have our Outstanding Citizen of the Year. And we're always kind of aping the world. The world has its approach to education. And so we have our approach to education. It's the same as theirs, except we baptize it a little bit. And we're constantly trying to say, if the world would only recognize us, if we could just get their approval. And Abraham knew 4,000 years ago, you let them put a foot in the door, and they'll take the whole credit. I don't know what it's like here, but in our area, you watch a sports event, and after the game, some guys hit 3 home runs. And so, hey, Joe, come on over here, and the mic and the whole thing. And listen, tell me, what was it like today? Was the ball as big as a beach ball? And the guy says, well, first of all, I want to give glory to my Lord and Savior. And the guy kind of flinches a little bit. Oh, okay, Joey. Now, were they fastballs that you hit? Was it just a good day? What did you have for lunch? And see, there's no way that announcer can say, oh, we should bow down and pray now. The God has enabled this person to play a sport for the glory of God. You see, we want to get that over with quickly, don't we, in the world? And you see it at the sports events, some dear soul holding up John 3:16, somebody else saying, Jesus loves you. And we're desperately trying to tell the world that this is what it's about. There's no glory in the world. It's fading. If you've seen the movie Sunset Boulevard, this aging, silent movie star who's way past her prime, and she hires her own scriptwriter, and she pays him a fortune so that he will write a movie, and she's going to be the star in every scene. And she has no idea that she's passed it by. That her moment on the stage was fleeting. She doesn't have the look. She doesn't have the sex appeal. She doesn't have the charm. She doesn't have the voice. Because these are different kind of movies than the silent movies that she starred in. And every generation does the same thing, don't they? Because you see, it desperately wants the glory. And it will kill anybody to get that glory. Now, the amazing thing about being a Christian is that you never live more. You never live more than when you are giving all the glory to God. Because that's why you were created. That's why you were fashioned and formed in the likeness of God. That's why you were redeemed. God has saved me, so not that he can be stroked, but so that I can be doing what I was made to do. And that is to acknowledge that the most wonderful, glorious being in all the universe is after the order of Melchizedek. We don't have the time, unless we won't have question period, to go into all these marvelous truths, but this man appears and disappears. And he just comes to bless. He just comes to remind the world that what Abram is about is the glory of God. That the only explanation for his life is that the blessing of God rests upon him. And the only explanation for the successes in his life is that the hand of God was with him. And God defeated the enemy. If Israel would learn that lesson, they would have been fine. And you see, what I need and what you need and what we desperately need as we live in this world is that God will defeat the enemies. And we know that there came one who was after the order of Melchizedek, who entered into the fullness of time so that he might bring a death blow to death. And he will bring a death blow to death by bringing a death blow to sin. Indeed, all righteousness will be found in him. And that's why all peace is found in him. Melchizedek did not follow anybody. No one followed Melchizedek. He is the only priest who reigned as a priest king in his order, until someone from the very loins of a dead biological man named Abram will sit on the throne of David and will be a priest king. And he will do the astounding thing that he will go hand to hand with all of the evil in this world, all the cursedness in this world, and he himself will become cursed, so that people like you and I, direct descendants spiritually of Abram, might be blessed. Isn't that amazing? What a gospel. The world says this book's nonsense. Who would read something 4,000 years ago and talk about it for an hour? Oh, if it's just something that was written 4,000 years ago, sure. I mean, I don't even get off on Shakespeare, and that's what, 400 years ago. But oh, if it's about Jesus, if it's about the faith, if it's about the gospel, if it is about God Almighty, the creator of heaven and earth, that who could justly have left the world in its sin and its misery, who could have very easily said to Adam, okay, is this what you want? You can have it. But he enters into the very world that Adam created by his sin, with all of its chaos and confusion, with all of its misery and its sorrow and its suffering and its tears. And he was amongst his people. He was in this world, wasn't he? He was touched by our infirmities. But oh, he refused the glory of this world, because he came to bring glory to his Father. And you see, that kind of faith is honored. Because people who live like that will live forever. Because the astounding blessing of God is this, that although there is a judgment for sin, which is death, Christ has so taken the smack out of death that even for the child of God to die is a blessing. Because we're ushered into the presence of the blessed God himself. And so for the believer, we can go out into this world, and we can get involved with this world, and we can love the people of this world, and we can risk our lives again and again and again and again, because it's win-win for us. Paul says in Philippians, I'm torn. I don't know whether it's better to live because we win, or to die because we win. The book of Hebrews says that Satan keeps the world in bondage to the fear of death, but not for the child of God. You see, I'm not going to be afraid to die when my time comes, because for 38 years I've been dying. And what I've seen over the last 38, 39 years is that I have a God who every time I've died has brought resurrection. Death does not have the last say. And there's life that always comes out of death. But you see, God never resuscitates. He never does mouth to mouth when we're half dying. What he loves to do is, oh, your friend is sick. And Jesus says, well, we don't go now. He's not dead yet. And when he dies, then they go. And he's been dead 4 days. There's proof. You just go near the cemetery, and he was dead. But oh, that the glory of God might be seen. Dead men live again. And that's the culture we have to reach. A culture that is dead spiritually, who lives in the grip of death constantly. And yet the astounding thing is, sinners like you and I have received everlasting life. And we go out into this world, and there's nothing they can do to take away our life, because that life is found in Jesus, and Jesus is found in us. If we're going to serve Christ in our generation, we have to be in the world. But if we're going to serve Jesus Christ in our generation, we cannot be of this world. And who would want to be when you have a God who blesses you, and a God that you can bless and exalt and magnify, the maker and creator of heaven and earth, the one who says to every poor, feeble sinner who believes in him, blessed are the meek, you will inherit the earth. What a gospel. And no wonder we can give it all away, because it's ours, and we cannot lose it. They can take our possessions, they can take, you see, there's nothing we have in this world that is of that value to us, as long as they don't take our Jesus. They tried to, and they put him to death, but he was vindicated in the Spirit on the third day, and he ever lives as a great high priest to make intercession for his people. And oh, he's coming again, isn't he? It will be glorious. Every dictator, every despot, every person who was convinced there was only life in this world will see him and instinctively bow the knee and will have to say that the carpenter from Nazareth is the Lord God. He is the Lord. He always has been the Lord. And he will be acknowledged forever and ever. And for all eternity, there will be the standing ovation of Jesus, Jesus. And it will go on and on and on and on. We'll say, he is my Lord and my Savior. And Jesus himself will say, I'm not ashamed to call them my brothers. He will stand before his Father and he will say, here am I and the children that you have given me. These are the children of Abraham, because they believed God while they lived in the world, but were not of it.